At 44, Justin Gatlin finally confessed. The 5 runners he hated the most. There is a version of Justin Gatlin the world never fully saw. Not the finger over the lips at the finish line. Not the bow in the direction of Usain Bolt after London. Not the composed silence of a man who had learned to carry the crowd's hatred for so many years that it had stopped producing the effect it was designed to produce. There is a version that existed in the years the sport took from him. In the training sessions during a 4-year ban that the record books would carry forever as the context for everything that came after. In the quiet before races where the booing had already begun before the gun had fired. At 44, far enough from the track to speak without the competition shaping the words, Gatlin named 5 runners who made that version of him necessary. Every world title he collected, every finish line he crossed after the bans and the alcohol, and the near-suicidal thoughts of the years the sport had removed him from, every result he produced at an age when the sport had already written the chapter on what he was supposed to be capable of. All of it was shaped by the men who forced him to become more than the circumstances had tried to reduce him to. At 44, he finally said their names. 5 runners, 5 different versions of the same hatred, 5 men he genuinely could not stand to race. Number 5. Asafa Powell, the Jamaican who held the world record and made every preparation feel like chasing a number that kept moving. Asafa Powell of Jamaica held the 100-metre world record with 9.77 seconds in 2005. The same year, Gatlin won the World Championship gold in Helsinki and produced everything the career had been building toward since Athens the year before. The 2 timelines ran alongside each other for years in the specific way that parallel ambitions in the same event run alongside each other, close enough to feel like the same argument, far enough apart to never fully resolve into a single decisive result. From 2003 onward, Gatlin had identified Powell as the specific competitor whose presence on a start list changed the internal calculation of every race they shared. He said it directly on Powell's own podcast years later. From 2003 to around 2007, there was only one individual he had to worry about, and that was Asafa Powell. When Powell lined up, Gatlin knew he had to be on guard because there was one individual on the face of the planet who could run stride for stride with him. That acknowledgement, offered years after the rivalry had concluded, communicated what the competition itself had produced in real time. The hatred was never about Powell personally. Gatlin had said he admired the consistency of Powell's technique. How from 2003 onward nothing had changed. One way of running, executed the same way every time, while Gatlin went through adjustments and the ban and the return, and all the years of revision that a career interrupted and rebuilt requires. Powell's consistency was itself a form of pressure. The knowledge that the man beside him was not going to arrive at a different version of himself on race day. That what you prepared for was what you were going to face. And the specific hatred of a rival whose consistency produces a kind of inevitability is a hatred that the race results alone can never fully discharge. Powell held world records that Gatlin never reached. When the ban came, and the records were stripped, and the comparisons began, Powell's name sat in the conversation as the standard the sport had maintained in Gatlin's absence. The hatred was not of Powell the man, it was of what Powell's continued presence communicated during the years the track had become unavailable. Number 4. Tyson Gay. The American who made the domestic rivalry feel like a second career's worth of unfinished business. Tyson Gay won the 100-metre, 200-metre and 4-pile 100 relay triple at the 2007 Osaka World Championships. He was, at that moment, the fastest American alive, a title that carried specific weight in the context of Gatlin's career because the ban had prevented Gatlin from being present in 2007 to dispute it. Gay collected the championship gold that the year before Athens had positioned Gatlin to own across multiple cycles, and he collected it with times that made the argument about American sprint supremacy feel settled in a way it had not been settled when Gatlin was still present to contest it. They shared the flag, shared the selection process, shared the national identity that American sprinting carries to international championships. They were not simply rivals. They were the two men the American sprint program needed to compare whenever the question of who carried the country's best argument at the top of the 100 metres arose. And for a long stretch across the late 2000s and into the return years of the early 2010s, the comparison kept producing an answer that placed Gay in the position Gatlin had occupied before the ban. At the 2012 London Olympics trials, Gatlin finished first. Gay finished second. The domestic order had been established, and then London produced a final where Bolt won in 9.63 seconds, Blake finished second, and Gatlin ran 9.79 seconds to take bronze. Gay ran 9.80, 1/100th of a second behind the bronze, and cried in the post-race interview. The domestic rivalry had produced Gatlin on the Olympic podium and Gay 100th outside it. 100th. The precise margin that made the comparison in London go one way rather than the other. Gatlin said what Gay gave him was the hatred of a domestic argument that never produced a final answer the American sprint community was willing to accept as conclusive. Every time one of them finished ahead of the other one produced a result that reopened the case. The hatred was never simple because Gay was never dismissible. He kept coming, without ever fully arriving at the moment that settled the argument permanently. Number 3. Yohan Blake, the Jamaican who arrived with a specific violence that made every race feel like a dispute about the order of things. Yohan Blake of Jamaica won the 2011 World Championship 100-metre gold in Daegu after Usain Bolt was disqualified for a false start. He ran in 9.92 seconds in a final that produced a result without its anticipated centrepiece, and in doing so, established himself not as a beneficiary of Bolt's absence, but as a legitimate claimant to the conversation about who the event's elite were. Then he ran 9.75 seconds in 2012, the second fastest time in history at that point, and arrived at the London Olympics as the man Bolt himself identified as the rival he respected most. Gatlin shared start lines with Blake across the London 2012 cycle and beyond, and what Blake gave him was something different from what Powell and Gay had given him in the years before the ban. Powell and Gay were rivals whose presence required preparation. Blake required a different kind of internal accounting. He was not smooth in the way that great sprint champions are smooth. He was aggressive, the kind of aggressive that communicates itself through the body before the gun fires, in the call room, in the warm-up area, in every pre-race moment that precedes the race itself. He had been called the Beast, and he ran with the specific intention of making the name accurate. At the 2012 London Olympics 100-metre final, Bolt won in 9.63 seconds. Blake ran 9.75 and took silver. Gatlin ran 9.79 and took bronze. The result placed them on the same podium in an order that the subsequent Diamond League seasons would spend years attempting to revise. But the revision never arrived cleanly. Blake kept producing times that communicated he had not accepted the hierarchy the podium photograph had established, and the specific hatred of a rival who treats the established order as a provocation rather than a result is a hatred that no single race ever permanently resolves. Gatlin said what Blake gave him was the hatred of someone whose entire competitive presence was designed to make the race feel personal before it had started. Most rivals at this level communicate through times and results. Blake communicated through the specific energy of a man who had already decided, before the blocks were set, that the result was going to require everything the preparation had built, and then some. And running against that energy for a career's worth of shared start lines produces a specific kind of hatred that outlasts the individual results. Number 2. Maurice Greene, the champion Gatlin dethroned in Athens, and who never fully accepted the dethronement. Maurice Greene of the United States won the Olympic 100-metre gold in Sydney in 2000. He was, at that moment, the fastest man in the world, not by narrow margins that the competition could contest, but through a combination of times and titles and competitive presence that the sprint world had spent years building its understanding of the event around. He was the standard, the man whose name sat at the front of the conversation about who the 100 metres belonged to before Usain Bolt arrived to make that conversation irrelevant. At the 2004 Athens Olympics, Gatlin ran 9.85 seconds and won the gold. Greene finished bronze. The result communicated, with the specific clarity that Olympic finals communicate, that the conversation had a new name at the front of it. Gatlin was 22 years old. He had displaced the reigning champion on the biggest stage the sport possesses. And the specific hatred of a champion whose throne you have just taken, a champion who knows exactly what the throne cost and who will not pretend that its loss is anything other than what it is a hatred that produces a different kind of pressure from any other rivalry. Greene's presence in Gatlin's career carried that weight in both directions. For Gatlin, it was the weight of having produced the result that displaced a man who had defined the era before him, and of knowing that the man he had displaced understood better than anyone what the displacement meant. The Athens gold that established Gatlin as the new standard had come at Greene's expense, and the subsequent years in which the ban interrupted everything were years in which the standard Gatlin had set in Athens was being occupied by other names, while the man who had originally held it watched from outside the conversation. Gatlin said what Greene gave him was the hatred of a standard he had taken from someone who understood its value better than most. The hatred was complicated by the fact that taking a title from a champion who had defined the era before you does not simply produce a new era. It produces a man who knows exactly what was taken, and who will spend every subsequent race reminding you of it through the specific intensity that former champions bring to the races they have already lost the most important version of. Number 1. Usain Bolt, the man who turned his greatest rival into a villain and made the crowd cheer for the story rather than the race. Usain Bolt of Jamaica won 8 Olympic gold medals, set 3 world records at a single Olympics, and redefined what the sport understood to be the ceiling of human sprint performance. He was, across the decade from 2008 to 2017, not simply the best sprinter in the world. He was the sport's entire public identity. The name the cameras found first. The celebration the broadcasters built the coverage around. The single figure through whom the entire narrative of global sprinting was filtered. Gatlin competed against that figure for the better part of a decade. And what Bolt gave him, what no other rival in the 5 came close to giving him, was the specific hatred of a competition that the sport had decided was not between 2 athletes, but between 2 stories, good and evil. The superhero and the cheat. The man who had never failed a drug test, and the man whose entire career had been conducted under the shadow of the ones he had. Gatlin beat Bolt once in 9 100-metre head-to-heads before London 2017. Once, in Rome, in 2013. The result produced no adjustment in the narrative. The story the sport had built around their rivalry absorbed the single loss and continued presenting the competition as though the outcome was predetermined. Gatlin could win individual races. The narrative had already decided who it belonged to. London 2017 was the night the narrative failed to produce the result it had been promised. Gatlin ran 9.92 seconds and crossed the line first. Bolt took bronze in his final individual race. The crowd began booing before Gatlin had slowed down. Tens of thousands of voices, not directed at what he had done in that race, but at what his presence in the race meant for the story they had come to see completed on its own terms. He put his finger to his lips, and then he walked to Bolt and bowed. Gatlin said afterward that it left him scratching his head, that he had gone through all the channels, done everything the sport required, served the ban, returned, competed, tried to inspire younger athletes about mistakes and comebacks, and what it meant to correct yourself and continue. And still, the crowd treated his victories as disruptions rather than results. The bow to Bolt communicated everything that the victory itself could not. That Gatlin understood, better than anyone in the stadium, what the rivalry had actually been about. Not speed, not competition. What the sport needed to believe about itself. And the specific hatred that produces is unlike any other rivalry. The hatred of a competition the world had already decided the winner of before the gun had fired, and that Gatlin had spent an entire career running against regardless. The hatred Bolt gave him outlasted the career. It sat in the London result exactly as it happened. And at 44, Gatlin finally said what the bow had already communicated without words. That the rivalry with Bolt had been the most honest and the most painful thing the career had produced. Because it was the only one where the result had never been enough to settle the argument on Gatlin's terms. At 44, Justin Gatlin had nothing left to prove. The titles were counted. The records were in the books. The career that had survived 2 bans, a 4-year absence, alcohol, depression, and the specific cruelty of a crowd that booed at the finish line had been completed in a way that the sport's judgment of him had never fully accounted for. What he had at 44 was honesty. 5 runners, 5 different versions of the same hatred. Asafa Powell gave him the hatred of a standard that kept moving. Tyson Gay gave him the hatred of a domestic argument that never produced a final answer. Yohan Blake gave him the hatred of a rival who made every race feel personal before it started. Maurice Greene gave him the hatred of a standard he had taken from someone who understood its value better than most. And Usain Bolt gave him the hatred that outlasted the career, the only rivalry where the result was never enough to settle the argument on his terms. The world saw the bows, the silence, the finger over the lips. What the world did not always see was the 5 names that made the silence necessary. At 44, he finally said them out loud.